The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank.
With the greatest pleasure and joy, I welcome to this episode of Off the Cuff, Ashley Tellis. Now, Ashley Tellis, if I started introducing him properly, it'll eat up into too much of his time, too much of our conversation time. But he is senior scholar at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He is of Indian origin, but that is not the only reason why he is a friend of India. He's a friend of India as an American strategic scholar. And he's been working on it for a very long time. That's his domain. And what he does is something that I envy all the time. He keeps producing books all the time. So hold up your latest one. Unfortunately, we don't have a hard copy yet in India.
Well, I will hold it up for you, Shekhar. And
it's striking asymmetries, nuclear transitions in Southern Asia. And what that means is, Ashley, if I may just sum up in a second before nobody wants to give the floor to somebody else. And now I have control, so I do the talking. South Asia, very poor country, even the Chinese call themselves a developing nation, has 3 nuclear weapons powers. But usually we think that nuclear weapons make you equal. But there are asymmetries. The 3 nuclear powers are not equal. And that's where Ashley begins and takes the argument forward. So Ashley, the floor is yours. Explain what you are saying.
Well, thanks, Shekhar. It's great to be here back with you on the program. I wrote the book because I noticed over the last 20 years quite dramatic divergences in direction in the 3 countries that the book focuses on, which is China, India, and Pakistan. There are clearly elements of convergence, and we can talk about those at length, but I was struck by the elements of divergence. And let me start by just highlighting some of the elements of divergence. China has transformed itself from what was a very weak nuclear power to a nuclear power that in time to come will be on par with the United States and Russia. And this is obviously a remarkable transformation in the local nuclear balance within Southern Asia. Pakistan, too, has shifted from being a very modest power with very modest capabilities around 1998 to a country that is invested very significantly in nuclear weapons of enormous diversity and of remarkable sophistication in many ways. And India, of course, is still in the game. But what I found most striking, after the research was the conservatism that still marks India's thinking about nuclear weapons and its nuclear capabilities. And that is not meant as a criticism. It's just simply a description that of all the 3 countries in the region, India alone seems to have hewed to the vision that it had articulated in 1998. China has moved very differently away from the Maoist vision of nuclear weapons. Pakistan has moved very differently.
What was the Maoist vision of nuclear weapons? I'm curious.
Well, the Maoist vision of nuclear weapons was that having nuclear weapons themselves deter. You don't need too many of them. You don't need to have them at high levels of readiness. But the very fact that China had some nuclear weapons was good enough for deterring even the great powers. Now, that vision has changed completely, and under Xi Jinping is poised to change even more dramatically than it has in the past. So I emphasize in the book that during the Cold War, China probably never had an inventory that exceeded 200 nuclear weapons, if that. Today, I think the judgment is that China has somewhere around 350 nuclear weapons, and it is on track to double that number within the next few years. And the Pentagon is assessing that the Chinese nuclear arsenal will move towards a 1,000 strong force sometime, during this decade. So that's a very remarkable transformation. You look at Pakistan. In 1998, the Pakistani ambition seemed to have been an inventory of about 60 or 70 nuclear weapons. That was the initial requirement that the Pakistanis had determined was adequate for their security in the aftermath of the 98 nuclear tests. Today, the Pakistani arsenal has gone way beyond those numbers. And obviously, there's still no end in sight. India has never formally articulated what its nuclear requirements are. But the judgment is that India probably has somewhere around 100 to 150 nuclear weapons. But those are very squishy numbers. My own suspicion is that the Indian arsenal is actually much smaller than the public numbers suggest, only because India has stayed faithful to what has been its traditional approach, which is to maintain a relatively large stock of fissile materials, but not convert those fissile materials into actual weapons. And so India, in that sense, is still got a very conservative posture that I think is quite remarkable. So it's these divergences that I found interesting and which I thought were worth elaborating and looking at more closely.
So you mentioned the judgment on India, China and India. What's the judgment on Pakistan in terms of the numbers?
There is no strong evidence that tells us what those numbers are. But the fissile material stocks, that is the weapons grade fissile material stock, suggest that Pakistan could have as many as 200 weapons or even more. And the difficulty with giving you a good fix on the numbers is that the weapons themselves have become enormously diverse since 1998. So in 98, we could make some reasonably good judgments because you could say a standard Pakistani design uses, say, 20 kilograms or 22 kilograms of HEU. And then you divide the total stockpile by that number.
Highly enriched uranium.
Highly enriched uranium. And you could get a number based on that division. Today, the diversity of weapons designs in the Pakistani arsenal is so significant that we do not know what the appropriate metric for dividing the fissile material stockpile is. So at one end, you could have weapons that use somewhere around 20 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, all the way to weapons that use as little as 1 to 3 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, because the Pakistani arsenal has become so diverse. So there is a squishiness in numbers pertaining to Pakistan that are very hard to get a fix on. And I think only the Pakistani state really has, accurate data on what its inventory is today.
Well, it depends on how we describe the Pakistani state. So which means which element or which core of the Pakistani state. But using great diversity in Pakistani weapons. Just elaborate on that a bit more. I know that your book has a lot of the stuff, but elaborate that a bit more.
So Pakistan is moving from what was primarily an aircraft delivered force. The F-16 was the principal delivery weapon for Pakistan's nuclear weapons from the late 1980s onwards. Then those weapons were supplemented by missiles. And you remember the famous M11s that came from China, first entered the force. They were then supplemented by the North Korean No-Dong missiles, which were christened the Gauri. And for a long time, Pakistan simply had aircraft and missile delivered weapons. Today, the aircraft delivered weapons have become more diverse in the sense that they're not simply gravity bombs, but there are increasingly cruise missiles and other standoff weapons. The missiles themselves have morphed into a multiplicity of systems. So you have short range, medium range, and intermediate range systems. And interestingly, Pakistan has now also diversified into naval nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons on cruise missiles. There is very interesting evidence that Pakistan is developing an anti-ship ballistic missile of the kind that the Chinese perfected about 10 years ago.
That's aircraft carrier killer.
That's right. The Pakistani version will probably be a shorter range missile, but the basic idea is the same, which is to use a ballistic missile which is based on land, close to the coastline, to be able to target, major surface combatants farther out at sea. So Pakistan is moving towards a triad of capabilities. There are nuclear weapons on board cruise missiles on their submarines, and in time there will be a nuclear submarine itself. So there is a remarkable diversity in terms of both the weapons, the payloads of those weapons, and then as a consequence, the amount of fissile material that is used in each of these weapons designs. And so that makes the task of assessing the size of the inventory, a very, very tricky proposition.
What about Pakistan's tactical nukes that they keep talking about quite a bit?
So Pakistan has developed a range of tactical nuclear weapons. The most prominent ones are nuclear artillery shells, atomic demolition munitions, which are essentially nuclear mines, and nuclear-tipped rocket artillery, which is, the Hataf 9 or the Nasser. Those are the three best known of their tactical nuclear weapons. And they've developed these tactical weapons because of the belief that India has a cold start conventional war option. And they are looking for ways to use their nuclear deterrent in ways that can frustrate India's cold start objectives. And so they have developed this variety of tactical weaponry. It was thought originally as a means of stopping the Indian onslaught. So when the initial discussions about tactical nuclear weapons surfaced in Pakistan, the common view was that these weapons would be used as NATO thought of tactical nuclear weapons used during the Cold War, which is to stop Soviet armored columns coming through the Fulda Gap. When I started looking closely at the Pakistani tactical nuclear weapons program, and the results are reported in the book, I discovered that they actually are very cognizant that their tactical nuclear weapons will not have the kind of operational effectiveness that people originally assumed they would. So what they are, I believe, going to use tactical nuclear weapons for, God forbid, if they have to be used, is mostly as a form of signaling. So it's not designed to create operational effects on the battlefield, but it is designed to signal to India that Pakistan is willing to escalate. Well, first, that Pakistan is willing to use nuclear weapons in its defense. Two, that is willing to escalate upwards if India does not stop the conventional operation. And three, it is designed to essentially bring in outside great powers in order to stop Indian conventional operations. So when you look at it in, sort of at a closer level of granularity, the tactical nuclear weapons are really symbolic devices which are designed to threaten escalation rather than effective operational weapons which are meant to create certain battlefield outcomes. And so in that sense, the Pakistani approach to tactical nuclear weapons is very different from NATO's, because NATO actually attempted to use these weapons to stop Soviet armored spearheads in their tracks. And that's why NATO deployed, hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons, at one point actually in the thousands. The Pakistanis do not have those kinds of numbers. And it is unlikely that they would build an arsenal with those kinds of numbers. So when you have a small number of tactical nuclear weapons, there are very limited operational effects that you can actually engender. So then what do you use them for? You use them basically for signaling. And you use them as a form of conveying a degree of brinkmanship in order to stop, a presumed Indian attack at that point.
So tactical nuclear weapons, particularly with this strategic thinking, is a very dangerous idea.
Well, I think it's a dangerous idea on many counts. First, I think the diversity actually does not buy Pakistan very much, because if your objective is simply symbolic use to deter Indian aggression, then any nuclear weapon does the job. I mean, why do you really need a tactical nuclear weapon? You can use a missile for exactly that purpose. In fact, you may not even need to use a missile. All you have to do is to brandish the threat of use, and you will capture India's attention, and you will certainly capture international attention. So in that sense, Pakistan has made investments in resources that at one level are unnecessary. But what was equally interesting as I began to do the analysis was that when you look at the conventional balances, right? And I spent some time actually describing the conventional balance as it exists today. The conventional balance suggests that Pakistan actually has remarkable defensive advantages vis-a-vis India. And it is going to be simply impossible to imagine a situation where India can do to Pakistan what the Germans did to France in 1940. That, Pakistan can defend against Indian conventional operations quite satisfactorily with conventional forces alone. And so that makes the acquisition of tactical nuclear weapons unnecessary, perhaps even redundant. And so I'm surprised that Pakistan has gone in this direction, but that's where they are.
So I'll take you back to 1990. 1990, the Pakistanis thought, quite rightly actually, that they had a nuclear advantage over India. And that's when the Gates mission took place. Bob Gates came to India and Pakistan, and the Pakistanis conveyed that warning that in case a war takes place now, we might start it with a nuclear weapon, right? And books were written about that, etc. So could the Pakistanis still be thinking on the same lines that this is not for our defense, this is for leverage? We tell the Indians that, look, we've got these chota bombs, we will drop a few here and there, and then we'll defy you to self-destruct with us completely.
I think the Pakistanis certainly think of nuclear weapons as leverage. In fact, in the book, I describe Pakistani nuclear weapons as having utility not simply for deterrence, but equally as a license for underwriting provocative Pakistani behaviors.
I may interrupt you as an instrument of coercion?
As an instrument of coercion, but the instrument of coercion is actually more subtle. I do not think Pakistan will threaten the use of nuclear weapons as a way of getting its way. I think what Pakistan sees its nuclear weapons as doing is giving it a freedom to wage low-intensity conflicts against India, supporting terrorism, supporting insurgencies, and so on and so forth. And then the nuclear weapons then act as a deterrent against any Indian reaction that takes the form of conventional military operations. So it's not the threatened use of nuclear weapons, but rather it's that nuclear weapons provide you cover. They give you a certain immunity, and that immunity is utilized to then support low-intensity warfare against India on the calculation that one, the low-intensity warfare will bleed India, through 1,000 cuts, and that's good enough. But if India ever chooses to react through a conventional response, then the nuclear weapons really come into their own, because they are the best deterrents against that conventional response.
And this psychological deterrence that you don't know these Pakistanis nutcases, they can actually use nuclear weapons.
I think they certainly take the prospects of use very seriously, because they see themselves as a weaker state. They see themselves as a state that is overwhelmed by Indian superiority. And so they genuinely believe that deterrence for them must extend to the readiness to use your weapons. And so use considerations are taken far more seriously in Pakistan than, for example, they are in India.
Yeah. So the Indian doctrine, which is publicly stated, India's nuclear doctrine, very clearly states that any use of weapons of mass destruction, irrespective of the scale, the size, and the target, will get a full-fledged response from India.
And India has stuck to that position quite consistently since 1998. Right. Despite all the debates within India about the credibility of that position. The National Security Advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon, in his book, opened the door to a discussion where India might deviate from what its stated doctrine is, because he discussed possibilities where India might not react through, the massive use of retaliation, but may respond in ways other than massive retaliation. Now, nobody knows what India's actual plans are, but, nuclear weapons have a sobering effect. Once you get into the escalation train, any nuclear use is going to have devastating consequences. Yeah. And so I think it doesn't really require doctrine, actually, to concentrate the mind as much as the reality of the weapons themselves.
Yeah. You talked about Mao's doctrine, which is, you have enough, this is a deterrent. Now, I'll take you back to how the Indian debate progressed. Indian debate went on in all directions. It was a very robust debate, from those wanting 1,000 bombs to those wanting 10 bombs. But ultimately, the side that won was, say, the K. Subramaniam, General Sundarji argument. I think Dr. Raja Ramanna also, if I remember correctly, was on the same argument, that more is not needed when less is enough.
Correct.
Are you now suggesting or debating or proposing that time has come to revisit that idea?
No, I think the basic intuition is correct. But you have to make a difference in the case of Pakistan and in the case of China. In the case of Pakistan, I think India's current capabilities are more than sufficient, because they are comparable to Pakistan's capabilities in a technical sense. The kind of damage Indian weapons can do is comparable to the weapons that Pakistan can do. And so there is, in a sense, a relatively stable standoff, even though the Pakistanis have, this diversity of weaponry that I talked about. In the case of China, I think it gets more complicated, and much is going to depend on the future of the Sino-Indian political relationship. As long as it's a cold peace, the quality of India's deterrent really doesn't matter, because the Chinese are not going to push India beyond the point where, major conventional war is a sensible strategy, much less nuclear war. I think the Chinese recognize that, of course, they have disagreements with India and so on and so forth, but are these disagreements to be resolved by nuclear war? I doubt it. But as one thinks about the longer term, the real issue in my mind is, if there is a serious crisis between China and India, and all my expectations about a Pacific relationship are sort of, proved wrong, then can an India, which possesses only simple fission weapons, effectively deter a China which has a very large number of thermonuclear weapons? Now, no one really knows the answer to this question. But in the past, statesmen, for very prudential reasons, have thought that having thermonuclear weapons are a good deterrent, simply because they are rather economical devices of mass destruction. And, in the book, I've done some comparisons which are sort of hair-raising, that the kind of damage that China can do with a single weapon compared to the kind of damage that India can do with its current arsenal, the asymmetries are extremely pronounced. So if you believe that effective deterrence requires some kind of parity in the ability to inflict comparable levels of destruction, then I think at some point India is going to have to rethink, the importance of thermonuclear weapons for its own arsenal.
Are you not convinced about India's thermonuclear test in 98?
Well, I know that there was an attempt to test the thermonuclear weapon, but I am not persuaded that that test was successful. Okay. And I think the consensus, both in the international community at the scientific level and in the international community at the political level, was that the thermonuclear test was a failure. And so I think it is a stretch to say that India today has a functioning thermonuclear weapon. I think that is a stretch.
Elaborate on this, the difference between the two, because not everybody is a scholar like you. And not everybody is a journalist who at least looks at these issues like me. There are lots of people out there. Make the distinction for them between why is one nuclear bomb not the same as another nuclear bomb? What's the big difference? And why do you say one Chinese bomb can do enormous damage, which India cannot counter with its entire arsenal?
So fission weapons of the kind that India tested in 98, I believe have yields of somewhere around 12 to 15 kilotons, which is roughly the yields that were demonstrated at Hiroshima.
Right.
They are what are called single stage weapons, which is, there's only one stage that ignites and produces the yield. Thermonuclear weapons are two-staged or multi-staged weapons. So it's essentially, you can think of it, to describe it most crudely, as a fission weapon in the primary stage, which then ignites thermonuclear fuel in the secondary stage. And this combination of a primary plus a secondary is what creates enormous yields. And the yields are yields that can go as high as in the megaton range. So you're not talking of kiloton level yields, but you're talking of yields that are orders of magnitude greater. And because the yields are orders of magnitude greater, the destructive power of those weapons is truly immense. So I'll explain this to you with a simple example. If you took an Indian weapon of the kind that was tested in 1998 and detonated it on a Chinese city, it would only create damage on a small fraction of that city. Whereas if you took a Chinese thermonuclear weapon and detonated it on an Indian city, it would be able to devastate almost the entirety of the city, depending on what city you're talking of and what weapon you're talking of, with a single blast. So you're really talking of enormous differences in destructive capability. And the reason why the great powers during the Cold War went in the direction of thermonuclear weapons was because they actually produced for the first time one bomb, one city destructive capability. So you could destroy an entire city with a single bomb. And so in that sense, it sounds macabre, and it is macabre. But in that sense, it allowed you to threaten enormous levels of destruction in an economical way. Economical in the sense that you don't need to use multiple weapons, you can use a single weapon. And so thermonuclear weapons came to constitute the heart of US and Russian nuclear arsenals. But very interestingly, it also became the primary weapon in the Chinese arsenal. In fact, the Chinese developed thermonuclear weapons faster than any other great power. And they made certain that all their long-range missiles were equipped with high-yield thermonuclear weapons, precisely because they operated on the assumption that they were not sure that many of their missiles would survive, but they wanted to ensure that even the small number of surviving missiles would be able to unleash enormous amounts of destruction. And that, calculation obviously paid off for the Chinese, and now they seem to be multiplying the numbers of missiles as well.
So what is India's capability in the thermonuclear area, even if you say that that test wasn't successful?
I think India has, obviously, they understand the physics of thermonuclear weapons well enough. They've demonstrated, I think, at least in the way that they tried to do their test, an understanding of the effects in the way that they placed the weapon, in the way that they placed it relative to the depth of the shaft, and so on and so forth. But I think they simply have not demonstrated that they have a viable weapons design. And, you can't demonstrate that theoretically. It has to ultimately be done through, what is called a hot test, which is actually put a working device in the ground and light it up. Now, the reason India didn't do a series of tests after the May 11th series in 1998 was because I think there was an erroneous early conclusion that the test was successful, when that did not turn out to be the case. And my sense is that at some point in the future, there's obviously nothing imminent, there's nothing compelling at the moment, but at some point in the future, India might want to go back, to validate the thermonuclear device. And especially if other great powers return to nuclear testing, then I think it is almost inevitable that India will follow suit in order to validate those designs.
Yeah. You used an expression, cold peace. How would you describe the current situation between India and China?
I think it's obviously I don't want to say combustible, but it is terribly frosty, in the sense that this is not the kind of relationship that either India or China imagined in 1987, when they were trying to put the pieces back together again. And the current standoff, as it were, is certainly not desirable from the viewpoint of either state, because it is forcing India to expend enormous resources in maintaining forces along a border at force levels that historically have simply not been sustained. And the costs of maintaining these large numbers of forces is not trivial. And the same is also true for the Chinese. But I think the Chinese have made the calculation that they are sitting pretty, on territories that India will not do anything to push them off. And so I think they're prepared to play this waiting game until such time, a negotiated solution sort of presents itself. And what is it that the Chinese actually want? That is somewhat, obscure at this stage. I suspect that what they want is more than just clarity about territory. What they want is clarity about India's strategic direction. And they believe that India has moved far closer to the United States than Beijing is comfortable with. And that India's growing partnership with the United States is seen as part of a containment strategy towards Beijing. And, this, at least in part, seems to be shaping Chinese attitudes towards India with respect to the current crisis on the border.
And that's the reason you think they came there?
Well, who knows, right? I mean, these things are opaque in ways that are hard to comprehend. But I think the developments in Indian domestic politics with respect to, the changed status in J&K, the broader concerns about India's strategic direction, the intensifying sense of competition between the two countries, I think all these played some sort of a role. But, we will never really know for certain.
So is this cold peace or hot peace?
Well, at least after the initial tragedies at Galwan, we've not had a loss of life. Hopefully that can be kept in that way. And if it is that, then, I wouldn't call it a hot peace because thankfully there've been no exchanges of fire. There've been no, further casualties on either side. There's just a standoff that involves many thousands, tens of thousands of troops and a negotiation that doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Yeah. Now the Chinese take a long view of things. Chinese are also not so stupid as to not understand that India is really not a camp follower of the US. You've also commented on our foreign minister's statement that, it's some kind of non-alignment forever. Are the Chinese miscalculating, or the Chinese just being good bullies and telling India, listen, we know that we want to explain to you, or we want to reveal to you what your limitations are?
I think, the element of bullying is very clearly part of this whole calculation. But it's also their equivalent of the shot across the bow, which is to say that, we are concerned about your direction. And we want to signal to you that a further evolution, a further deepening of this partnership, with the United States will prove costly to you. And we have the capacity, to make those costs stick. And if that is part of the calculation, then, everything that they've done so far becomes explicable. Now, what I think they need to appreciate are two things. One is that India may be weaker, but it's not a pushover. And two, India will take sides based on its judgment about necessity. And India did that once in 1962. India did that again in 1971 in a different way. And India is doing it again for the third time, in the aftermath of the crisis on the border. So if the Chinese think that they can push India to change its policy through a strategy of coercion, I think they're terribly, terribly mistaken.
But Chinese have been mistaken before. It's not as if they are so smart.
Absolutely.
Do you think the
Absolutely.
Chinese miscalculated on Taiwan, upping the ante like this?
That's actually a very good question, and we won't know the answer for quite some time. But what the upping the ante tells me is how concerned Xi Jinping is that he is losing control of the broader dynamics in the region. And so the upping the ante, to my mind, is a sign of Chinese anxiety that if they do not find ways of kicking the US in the shin and kicking the Taiwanese in the shin and reminding them that there is, in fact, a one China policy that is inviolable, that this trend will only, gather steam, as it were, and leave China off in an even more difficult position. And so I see this as really a Chinese reaction to their judgment that the one China policy is steadily eroding. Because what is really at issue in this whole, current crisis? They believe that the US professes a one China policy, even as it is systematically undermining it in practice. And they are determined to make certain that we understand that will be a very costly, that will be a very costly cause.
Now, you have some very innovative ideas for India and India's friends right now on how to address this asymmetry, the nuclear asymmetry. So we'll come to that. But before that, I'll keep taking some questions from our subscribers. Sunny Patel, who wants to know, what lessons do you think would the Chinese be drawing from the Russian experience in Ukraine?
So we had a book discussion yesterday at Carnegie, and one of my colleagues, Tong Zhao, said something that I found both persuasive and troubling. He said that the Chinese are drawing two lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One is that nuclear signaling actually works. That is, if you are about to engage in conventional aggression, then you are better off not just focusing on the conventional, but accompanying those conventional operations by very serious nuclear signaling. In other words, to deter the other side, to remind them that you have nuclear weapons and that you're capable of using them, which I thought is a form of nuclear coercion. That if the Chinese take to heart, promises even more trouble in the future. The second point he made was in the context of our discussion about China's expanding nuclear arsenal. And the point he made there was that China has drawn the conclusion that if you are going head to head with a major state like the United States, you cannot do so on the back of a token or a weak nuclear arsenal. You need to have a formidable nuclear force. Now, it may not be symmetrically capable to that of the United States, but you certainly cannot go up against the United States, which has 1,500 strategic weapons with a nuclear force of 2. You need to build capabilities that are closer to that of your adversary. And he used that as a way of suggesting the rationale for China's current nuclear expansion. So if these are the two lessons, that you need to have some facsimile of parity with your opponent, and two, conventional military operations have to be accompanied by resolute nuclear signaling. If these are the two lessons, then I fear that we are in for, a very difficult few years ahead.
So that's what Putin did. He did that nuclear signaling, and since then, everybody's concerned about escalating beyond any red lines that you imagine. You can only imagine that Putin has drawn.
Absolutely. And so to that degree, he has succeeded. And Tong's point yesterday was that this is something that the Chinese have appreciated. And I presume that means that that will become increasingly the new MO for China in the future. Now, if they go in that direction, that would be very interesting, because historically, China has been very careful not to brandish nuclear threats. Although it has been the victim of nuclear threats itself, China has been very careful not to talk about its nuclear weapons. But if, Putin's MO now becomes the new MO for Chinese policy,
what is MO? Please explain.
A modus operandi, a way of doing business.
I know. It's
So if that becomes the new way of doing business, then we are entering an unsettled environment.
Yeah. So I have Achyut Mishra. How long will China take to reach parity with the US in military might? Is it possible in the next 15 years? And if so, if that so happens, will Japan and India and Australia, I'm adding, continue to hedge with America's friendship or alliance or whatever? Or will they then sort of buckle under and accept China's hegemony?
So that's a difficult question to answer. Let me break it up into 2 or 3 parts. The quickest dimension where China can reach parity with the United States is in nuclear weapons. If the Pentagon is right, and China can build about 1,000 nuclear weapons, say by the end of this decade, then China is just 500 weapons short of the frontline US nuclear arsenal, which consists of about 1,500 weapons today. Now, we have many more nuclear weapons in reserve and on inactive status and so on and so forth. But at least the frontline weapons, China can reach parity, I would say, within the next 10 to 15 years. The uncertainty there is about China's fissile material stockpile. But China is an acknowledged NPT nuclear weapon state, so it can go back to producing fissile materials anytime it wants to. It may have never stopped producing fissile materials for all that we know. So the quickest path to parity and the area where it can reach parity quickest will be in nuclear weapons. When it comes to conventional forces, I think it is going to be much, much harder for China to reach parity. Now, I have to make the point here that China is not looking for conventional military parity with the United States, because the United States is a global power and it has military forces that operate all around the globe. What China wants, at least, for the next, I would say, 10, 20 years, is to build enough capabilities to be able to keep the United States out of maritime Asia. That's what it's aiming for. So it's not aiming necessarily to be able to operate, carrier task forces, in the South Atlantic. All they want is to make certain that the Western Pacific is a Chinese lake and not an American lake. And I think they can move towards those capabilities, within this decade. I think within this decade, if they maintain the pace of the buildup, they can get there. Now, this will be a formidable force, but it's not a force that is incapable of being defeated, right? Because the US also has resources and capabilities. The last part of that question is really the interesting one, which is as China builds the capabilities to keep the US further and further away from operating in proximity to its territory, how will the regional states respond? So far, the Japanese show no signs of buckling. They have doubled down on the partnership with the United States, as has Australia. So we have a very robust relationship with both the Australians and the Japanese with respect to the military balancing of China. I'm not talking the politics. The politics, is a different story. The real question for me is what is India going to do? Because for Japan and Australia, we know the answers. They're fairly straightforward. We have an alliance relationship. All we have to do is build up the capabilities. For India, there are two questions. One is, can India build up its capabilities fast enough? And then that takes you into issues of economic performance, societal stability, and so on and so forth. And two, even if India can build up those capabilities, what is the political context within which those new capabilities are going to be used? Will India choose to go it alone? Will India choose to deepen its ties, with the United States and its Asian partners? What is the sort of political, scaffolding that India will use as it builds up those capabilities? And I don't have good answers to those questions.
In your book, you suggest a way forward, and that also brings France into the equation. So let's get there now. Please explain that.
Okay, so I make 2 points about China's nuclear capabilities. And for simplicity's sake, let's just divide China's nuclear weapons into strategic systems and theater systems. Strategic systems are systems aimed at the United States. They're essentially intercontinental in range. Those systems are relatively inaccurate systems, which means that the best China can do with those weapons is to target American cities, but not American weapons, right? So in that sense, there is a certain modicum of stability. The theater systems, however, are undergoing a very interesting transformation, where China is building highly accurate theater missile systems. And it has also reduced the yields of the warheads on those theater missiles, which means that China now has within reach the capacity to target not simply an adversary's cities, but actually an adversary's nuclear weapons themselves. Now, this changes the equation in very dramatic ways where India is concerned. Because India's first line of defense for protecting its weaponry is opacity. Nobody knows where India's weapons are. But you cannot count on opacity remaining robust forever, because in an era where surveillance systems are ubiquitous, where there are more satellites, circling the earth every day, it is only a matter of time before a determined state is able to identify the location of various strategic assets. Now, if China gets to the point where it can identify these locations, and more importantly, now hold these locations at risk because it has very accurate theater missiles, then the question of the stability of deterrence in the India-China context gets reopened. That is, if there is a crisis, could China, God forbid, think of conducting splendid first strikes, as we used to call them during the Cold War, to destroy India's deterrent? And the argument I make in the book is that for the first time now, this risk is becoming real. That as long as Chinese weapons were inaccurate, this was not something India had to be worried about. But as Chinese weapons become more and more accurate, the survivability of India's land-based capabilities become at risk. So what's this?
That's why the maritime aspect of the triad has to be strengthened.
Absolutely. And so the best device for neutralizing this challenge is to go to sea. Now, Indians have understood this for a long time. It's not like, I've discovered the maritime aspect of the deterrent. I mean, Indian officers have been talking about this for years. But the point is, it will require a very capable submersible platform. And India so far seems to have had some difficulty with the first generation SSBNs that it has built, like the Arihant, which by many accounts is an underpowered system, and so on and so forth. So the argument I make in the book is that the US needs to think about how to assist India, not with respect to improving its nuclear weapons, but rather with respect to improving the platforms on which its sea-based nuclear weapons can be deployed. And the only impediments to this are policy impediments. They're not legal impediments, or they are not international regime obligation impediments. And so it's a policy impediment. So it's a decision that the United States government can change if it chooses to. And we've already changed it once. We've changed it with respect to AUKUS, where we've decided we're going to help Australia acquire these capabilities. And I make the point that we should now think seriously about helping India acquire a sophisticated submersible platform. And the best way to do this actually is in collaboration with the French, because the French platforms are extremely sophisticated. Their nuclear propulsion technology is superb. They have actually demonstrated the capacity to build very compact nuclear reactors, maritime nuclear reactors. And so the size of the vessels that France could help India build are exactly the kinds of vessels that would be perfect for India. And so the argument I make in the book is that this is the time for Indo-French-US collaboration on this issue.
So the answer to AUKUS is?
You say it, Shekhar.
You say it. You are
I said the answer is INFRES, but that was just cute.
India, France, and United States. Yeah. So that's an interesting thought. Now, these things take time. So even the Australians will not see the first SSN in their case
yes,
as a result of AUKUS for almost another 15 years.
Yes.
Time.
But in the Indian case, it can be much faster because there is already a design base that India has and demonstrated, in the SSBNs it has built. So the real question will be in 2 or 3 areas. The first is building a more efficient nuclear reactor. The second is silencing the platform, which is an extremely important investment, and India has to pay attention to it. And the third is ensuring persistent connectivity with the platform. Those are the three areas where I think, India could benefit from external assistance and external collaboration.
So, if I understand correctly, persistent connectivity means having secure satellites.
It can be more than satellites. I mean, it could be some land-based system. So, for example, we connect with our SSBNs both through space-based as well as through terrestrial systems. And we have airborne systems as backups. So we have a multiplicity of systems for connectivity. And India will sooner or later move in that direction anyway, because one of the points I make in the book is that India's current mode of communicating with its submarines is, those installations are located, they're very small number for one thing, and two, they are co-located, so they're located all in one place, and so they become very easy targets for interdiction by an adversary. But that's something that India will have to pay attention to. So it's the triad of propulsion, silencing, and connectivity that India needs to pay attention to.
And who will pay for this?
Well, I think these things are already budgeted because, India is already planning to have a SSBN force of 6 submarines. 2 have been launched. I think 1 is probably under construction right now. So that's the 3rd. And they're already talking of having follow-on submarines, in the decades to come. So my suggestion is, move earlier rather than later to incorporate these technologies as fast as possible. And it's a suggestion. I mean, I'm not, nothing stands or falls in it, but I'm simply looking for ways in which we can be helpful to India as it builds its subsurface capability, which I think is going to be the long-term solution to India's needs.
Well, all strategic attention is now shifting to the seas around India and Indo-Pacific, etc., in the region. And that's why your book is very timely, that it focuses in that area. Now, I can't let you go unless we come to the C question, which is the carrier question. Because it's carrier versus submarine has been an eternal debate everywhere, but it's even more important in India where resources are so limited. So you can have 3 aircraft carriers, or you can have this many submarines or submarines of this quality. So does India need aircraft carriers?
Well, to answer that question, Shekhar, you have to ask a prior question, which is, what are India's geopolitical objectives in the wider Asian continent? If Indian geopolitical objectives are confined to the contiguous sea areas around the peninsula, then India does not need aircraft carriers. Because if you say my political interests do not extend beyond 1,000 kilometers from my boundaries,
that will cover Karachi and Gwadar.
That's about right. But land-based air power can do the job just as well, if not better. But if you believe that India's geopolitical interests extend well beyond 1,000 kilometers, and that you are talking of everything from the east coast of Africa to the Southeast Asian region, if you think of that as being India's natural sphere of interest, then I do not see how you can get away without sea-based aviation in the form of an aircraft carrier. Because your land-based aircraft are relatively short-legged. I mean, the longest legs that any Indian aircraft currently has today is the Su-30. And the operating radius of an Su-30, fully loaded with all the equipment, weapons, all that stuff, is somewhere around 750 kilometers.
With refueling.
Well, refueling will get you further. So on your organic fuel, you can go up to about 750 kilometers. With refueling, you could probably add a third more, maybe a half more, depending on where you refuel. But you're essentially talking of 1,000 kilometers range. That's the limits of your land-based aircraft. But those capabilities are not persistent, because if you get out to 1,000 kilometers, your time on station is not more than 15 or 20 minutes. And then you come right back, right? So if you're talking of a persistent presence beyond a 1,000-kilometer line around the peninsula, then you have no alternatives but to invest in aircraft carriers. Now the question becomes, what kind? Now, for a variety of reasons, mostly because India didn't have the choice, it ended up building aircraft carriers of the worst kind, which is manpower-intensive platforms with very limited combat capability. And so India's put in a lot of resources into building, these jump jet carriers, right? So the carrier hosted the Harrier aircraft for a while. Now it's been replaced with conventional takeoff carriers like with the MiG-29. But these are still in very small numbers, and they are, again, very short-range aircraft. So what the logic suggests, and the US Navy has done studies on this now for over 40 years, that the only carrier that makes sense, both from the point of view of economics as well as from the view of operations, is a carrier that is 65,000 tons and above. Anything that is less than 65,000 tons is an uneconomical platform, because the costs of the platform far exceed the combat power that the platform deploys. Once you come to the 65,000 ton mark and above, your combat power increases dramatically, your sustainability increases dramatically, and you can do many more useful things with a carrier of that size. Now, the Indian Navy is fighting really hard for what they call IAC-3, which is the third carrier that they want to build, which will be somewhere in the region of 65,000 tons. And that is really the magic number in the kink of the curve. Because once you get to that 65,000 ton ship, you can have an air wing of anywhere between 40 and 50 airplanes, which is a sizable number, not as big as a US aircraft carrier, which has about 80 plus airplanes, but still good enough for the purposes that, India is applying itself to. So the real decisions, to my mind, are twofold. First, what are your geopolitical interests? Define that in geographic terms.
If I may interrupt, these could be more capable planes than MiG-29s.
Oh, I would think so. In fact, I think my impression is that the Indian Navy wants to get rid of the MiG-29s as fast as they can, because they are horrendous from the point of view of maintenance. The availability, the mission availability of a MiG-29 is really dismal. It has very short legs, certainly compared to the Su-30s that will be on Chinese carriers, and compared to any airplane on an American or a French carrier. And it has a relatively small weapons load. So on multiple counts, I think the MiG-29 is really part of the Indian Navy's past history. It's not the airplane for the future. And they're looking right now, in fact, at a replacement. And I believe they have looked at both the Rafale and the F-18s as possible replacements of the MiG-29. But that's absolutely right. Irrespective of what carrier you have, India is looking for a replacement aircraft. But the big question that I suspect is lying behind, the question you asked me, is whether India ought to make the investment in the IAC-3 and standardize on a large deck carrier of about 65,000 tons. And my view is you answer that question only by clarity about your geopolitical interests. And once you have clarity on that question, then the issue of the carrier answers itself.
Yeah. So don't build it as a status symbol.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it's a horrendous way to waste money if all you're looking for is status.
Yeah. And also, it's very expensive. And for a limited fleet, you have to put a lot of taamjham around it to protect it. Then you have to have a real big task force.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is why, the size of the carrier air wing and the quality of the carrier air wing becomes so critical. And so these are the decisions that I think Indian policymakers are grappling with, at the moment. We were I remember in the last years of the Obama administration, we had put in quite some time and effort in helping India with respect to carrier design. In fact, under DTTI, we had started a carrier working group. But my understanding is that that process sort of ground to a halt because India was not ready to make a decision on whether to buy that large deck carrier or not. But if India goes in that direction, I expect that the US will be willing to resuscitate that effort in providing design assistance and whatever else is required to help India acquire the capability.
Well, Ashley, you are taken seriously. We know both sides of the fence. So I hope they listen to you. And the truth to tell, if your idea comes to fruition, the inference idea, that might also calm down French anger a little bit for having been left out of AUKUS.
Yes, that was unfortunately a difficult episode for us.
Yeah. So thank you very much. You and I can talk for hours and hours, and we'll find time to do that. Maybe next time you are in Delhi and I take you out for a meal, or I'm in Washington, I'll still take you out for a meal.
No, I'd be happy to take you out at a meal in either place.
Wonderful. And we look forward to your book being available in hard copy in India. And when that happens, we'll request you to feature on our soft cover feature where we talk to the author of a new book. And it's like an online launch of a book.
Sure.
Ashley, just be creative, be naughty, and keep smiling.
Well, I have a track record on being naughty, so this is not the time to stop. But thank you, Shekhar. It was wonderful. Wonderful.
I learned so much. Thank you.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank,